This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. Like many people, I've come into the new year full of hopes and aspirations for the next 12 months. Maybe, like me, you're anxiously pacing the floor waiting for the F1 season to begin, or perhaps you've set yourself a more regular fitness goal, like running your first marathon or commuting to work by bike. Whatever you plan to do in 2025, come into your own way with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Powered by Live Hydroscience, Liquid IV helps you break the mould. Liquid IV is so easy and convenient to tear, pour and enjoy, and it comes in several fantastic flavours, like their new Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free Raspberry Lemonade, and other winners like White Peach and Rainbow Sherbet. As a regular flyer, I know how easy it is to become dehydrated, almost without knowing it, when you're travelling. That's why I always take Liquid IV on overseas trips. It's more than just a drink, and it's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water provides 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients. And what's more, it's always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. Embrace your ritual with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA. Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts will take the world by storm.
There's some big right out there, and you're gonna help me stop it.
Us?
Why, you got someplace to be?
On May 2nd.
Avengers are gone. No one's coming to save the day.
Their time.
I think we could be the people that are coming.
Has come.
Being the hero, there is no higher calling.
Let's do this.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts. Only in theaters May 2nd. Get tickets now. This film is not yet rated.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and talks about a possible change of direction engine-wise for F1 ramp up with a major meeting in Bahrain, making it a significant event both on and off track. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to explain all and ask if McLaren can break its curse in its other home Grand Prix is John Noble. Well, John, welcome to Bahrain. You're not long landed. So I've been here a little bit longer, but I got in this morning. You got in about 2 hours ago, I think you landed. So how are you enjoying Bahrain in your brief arrival?
I think I've been here less than an hour actually. So it's quite an interesting route out of Japan, because obviously Japan to Bahrain's not a standard kind of route for airlines. So you've got to kind of plot your way across Asia. I actually went. It was a 2-stop strategy. First stop Manila Monday night. Second stop Dubai last night, and then flew today. But I must admit I was quite jealous of, as I queued up at Nagoya Airport on Monday morning, the F1 charter for all the teams was going direct to Bahrain from there. So I saw Piastri walk past, all the Mercedes team, Alpine team, Haas, all the teams. Piastri was there. Yeah, Piastri. So I saw Ocon, bumped into Ocon, spoke to Kimi Antonelli very briefly. And then randomly, as I was walking back through the airport, Lewis Hamilton walked past in this amazing kind of blue outfit, like you'd expect him to wear in the paddock, but just looked like... just this kind of weirdness to bump into a tiny little airport in Japan to see Lewis Hamilton walking through with his normal bodyguards and stuff. So they all probably landed in Bahrain 12, 13 hours after that, and I've taken me 3 days. But no, all fine. Had some sleep. Raring to go tomorrow.
I can't imagine that you won't be able to go toe-to-toe with Lewis Hamilton on travel fashion. Surely you were equally stylish.
Yeah, of course. I had my my travel trousers and a couple of T-shirts. So, but no kind of stunning, fetching blue outfit, unfortunately.
Very, very disappointing for listeners to the podcast, so I'm sure had a much more dramatic image. But anyway, I'm sure you can do better next time. But anyway, we've got some good topics to talk through ahead of the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend. And we've not actually talked about this much on the podcast in the past few weeks. But obviously this weekend, there's that significant meeting about the possibility of a return to V10 engines or similar, albeit it's not kind of are they going to do something or not? It's much earlier in the process than that. But This has been talked about for a bit now, so can you explain what the state of play is with this? Is it a serious possibility, and what's actually happening this weekend?
Yes, there's a gathering of manufacturers on Friday. They've been not necessarily, I wouldn't say summoned, but they've been invited to a meeting by Mohammed Ben Sulayem and the FIA to discuss future engine direction. It's wrong to say this is a meeting they're going to go in and vote on. Is it V10? Is it V8? Is it coming in 28? Are we ditching the 26 regulations? It's not that. It's about hearing from the manufacturers, understanding what their kind of vision is for the future, understanding, are they committed to the turbo hybrids? Are they committed to some electrical element of the engine? Are they open to the idea of V10? Are they open to an idea of a V8? Does it need to be a turbo? Can it not be a turbo? So I think it's more to gather thoughts on where things are at, so then the FIA can go away and kind of plot what they believe is the right direction for Formula One. I think the concern is that the turbo hybrid engines are expensive, especially the battery element has become, and the battery element, as well as being expensive, is could be a big performance differentiator, because technology is moving on a lot. It's very complicated. It's kind of cutting edge of where we are with electric power in an engine that is actually starved of energy. So it's going to be a set of regulations where there isn't actually enough energy for these cars to be running flat out all the time on every lap. So these are the issues that are at play. And I think there's also probably the timing is also interesting, because amid all the kind of economic chaos being caused by Trump's tariffs in the US, this is going to impact car manufacturers. This is going to change the way they do business, the way they deal with America. Is America, going to be shut down as a market now? How's it going to impact them? If we go to a worldwide recession, how's this going to affect the manufacturers? And when we spoke to Nicholas Tombazis, the FIA single-seater director, back at the Chinese Grand Prix, he mentioned we need to get a move on when the sun's shining. We don't want to be reacting when it's a rainy day. So I don't think we anticipated that rainy day could be coming as quickly as it has. But I think it's actually quite important now that the FIA kind of gets a reading from the manufacturers on what is happening. And this isn't just at the team boss level of the 5 manufacturers. I understand that this is going to involve some of the company CEOs as well. So they want to know what's going on, because this is important for the future of Mercedes. It's important for the future of Audi. It's important for the future of Ferrari. So this is quite an important direction that they need to know where Formula One's going.
Yeah, it's interesting how the situation globally has kind of gradually loomed ever larger on this. 'Cause it started off with kind of a vague notional economic thing, and now there's very real things going on, very, very difficult to predict forces at work. So, that's going to add a fair bit of pressure to things. But I guess there's also, from the F1 perspective, the fundamental question of, do they want to continue to hitch their wagon fully to manufacturers? Because there is the possibility the manufacturers could say, no, we want to still go this way. And F1 thinks, do you know what? We actually have got so much economic power now with the interest elsewhere. We don't think we need to be quite so close to you. So that there's lots of different agendas and priorities going on there. This isn't just the manufacturers will decide. It's kind of very much an all stakeholders kind of thing. And obviously it'll still need the vast majority, 4 of the 5 would need to be on side for there to be a change of the PU manufacturers. But there's a lot of different agendas and considerations at work here, and some of those are with the manufacturers. Some of them might theoretically, in a worst case scenario, or most extreme scenario, cut out the manufacturers entirely if F1 wants to do that. I'd be surprised if they would, but it's a possibility. Yeah,
there's endless complications and endless counter arguments for aspects. For example, people talk about that moving to V10 with or without a KERS, you'd have the lighter cars, and this has been a vision of the FIA. Counter argument is, a V10 is going to need a lot more fuel to be filled up at the start of a race, so it's just as heavy as the current cars. There's been the push on the cost ground that it'll be cheaper to work on a V8 with or without the KERS, whether it's the current KERS we have or the power we had first time it came around. But developing V10s is expensive. V10 is a brand new, completely all new engine. If you went to a V8, for example, I think it's fairly, from my limited understanding of engines, I think it's quite straightforward to modify a V6 into a V8.
An 8's a much more logical choice.
Yeah.
I think a 10 has a number of problems as well as being even kind of less relevant. There's a reason the V10s haven't been that popular automotively. I mean, not at all really now, but even in the past, they've never really been the kind of configuration of choice. And there's various technical reasons for that with the balance of engines and that kind of thing. Technological solutions, but yeah, the V8s make a lot more sense to me.
Exactly. And there's also this notion of, Formula One can't be reliant on the manufacturers, that if they quit, if there was a economic depression, maybe that's, we don't know where this tariff situation's going. The world economy could blow up, could be a full-on trade war between the US and China.
Well, the JP Morgan Chase CEO said today that a global recession is a likely outcome of what's going on. I mean, can't be sure because it's so volatile, but this is a very real possibility.
Yeah, so at the end of 2008, for example, we lost Toyota, we lost BMW, we lost Honda. So manufacturers do pull the plugs. But then the romanticism about we can get independence in, we could attract Cosworth. But that's a scenario that only works if they've got enough customers. So an independent isn't going to fund $150 million to develop an engine if there's no customers to sell off the back of it. So there's lots of ideas and lots of arguments, but there's tons of counter arguments. And I think the interesting thing will be how you plot your way through all of this to come up with a solution at the end of it. I mean, my money, having spoken to lots of people, is a turbo V8 with KERS, which isn't a million miles away from the current engines. But I think it would tick a lot of boxes in terms of, should be cheaper because the current technology is quite relevant. I think a turbo V8 would be slightly better than these current engines, decent amount of power, ticks the boxes on lots of fronts, and wouldn't be dramatically expensive to develop. But then Audi and Honda are pretty clear that the increased electrification coming for next year is why they came in. Either came in or returned and came back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree that a V8 makes sense. There's no reason not to have a turbo. That seems a logical move. And yeah, having some kind of KERS type sort of reduced hybrid element makes sense. And actually, just from a pure technical perspective in terms of what the cars are, I don't really like the 26 regs because they've set that power unit objective and they've distorted everything to try and make it work and get the performance out of it. And it's, everything they've done, the straight line mode and the corner mode is about reducing drag. Pirelli's had to compromise the width of the tyres in order to contribute a little bit of drag reduction. We heard George Russell complaining about the contact patch of the tyres. Well, Pirelli have been told to do narrower tyres that perform the same. And it's they've said, well, we'll try, but that's not easy. So there's this whole litany of compromises. So there's an argument for it. But obviously, whatever happens, these engines are going to arrive next year, aren't they? That seems pretty much inevitable now because it's not practical to roll back. So we're talking 28, 29 realistically for this, so if something does change.
Yeah, I think any notion that the 26 regs will be scrapped and we roll over these cars and these power units into next year, forget it. It's too complicated. You've got the Audi problem of they haven't got a current engine. Mercedes have already shut down development of this engine. It can't be ramped up to provide customers next season. Red Bull doesn't have a current engine, so I think it's too difficult to do it. So we're realistically talking about 28, 29, 30. I think the issue really is, what are these 26 regs going to be like? Because I think there are concerns that the engines are going to be energy starved, that it could become a bit of an economy formula and not spectacular. And if there are problems, if the racing's not very good, and we've got a massive spread, it's not impossible that we go from a season like this where 1/10 a second is deciding pole position, front row of the grid, 5th or 6th on the grid. It's so close to, could be 3-4 seconds difference next season. So if the grid's blown apart, if everything's homologated and stuck so people can't improve, then it's not going to change over the rule cycle. Then maybe that will force a fast track for us to come in. But I was speaking to someone from Audi last weekend in Japan we're just discussing the 26 regulations and this problem of the car's been energy starved and the complications it caused. And they reminded me that originally when Audi came in, they were suggesting that we get a energy recovery off the front axle, that this would cure the problem. You get enough recovery from that to better power the batteries, and we wouldn't be having any of this. You wouldn't have had the compromised power units. You wouldn't have the compromised cars. You wouldn't have the other compromised regulations to stop aggressive derating. But this was blocked by the other teams. I think they were a bit worried that Audi would have had a head start on this because of their knowledge from sports cars, so it didn't happen. But I think when you look at the plot of this regulation, I think a lot of decisions have been made that haven't quite gone the right way. And I just hope we don't get to start of next year and the first race and think, oh, we've got 3 more years of this.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Even if they do suddenly say, oh, we've got a consensus, we've got an agreement, we're going to go this way and scrap these engines, which I'd be surprised if we get that very quickly. But even then, you could be looking at 3 years at the start of 26 of something that's not working. So Nicholas Tombastis is adamant that 26 regs will work well, but the proof remains in the pudding, doesn't it? And we hear some very concerning things, I would say. I do feel like any rule set, there tends to be kind of a dominant parameter that they're chasing, and this is all about making that notional 50-50 electrical to conventional power, although it's actually a little bit more in favour of the conventional power in reality, making that work. And a lot of compromises. But the meeting's on Friday. We'll have loads of coverage of it on the race. I'm sure we'll talk about it on the podcast in the future, on Patreon for the Race Members Club, on videos and written forms. However you like your F1 coverage, we've got you sorted. We'll get back to the podcast in a moment, but first, let me tell you about Grammarly. Your time and expertise are valuable, and with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster with AI prompts, tone suggestions, and more. And what's more, you can enjoy it with peace of mind with Grammarly's enterprise-grade security and its business model that doesn't sell your data. Experience the gold standard of responsible AI with Grammarly, a tool that 93% of professionals report helps them get more work done. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Uh-oh, the last cookie.
You can get a new box of cookies in as fast as an hour with Walmart Express Delivery.
Are you my guilty self-conscience?
No, I'm the voice offering you promo code EXPRESS for free delivery on your first order.
Hey, who ate my cookies?
You mean, these cookies?
Order now. Welcome to your Walmart. Promotion valid for first express delivery order. $50 minimum subject to availability. Restrictions apply.
Right, John, let's look ahead a bit more to on-track this weekend. Suzuka was pretty straightforward on track. That unexpected win for Max Verstappen ended the McLaren dominance. McLaren's actually never won in Bahrain, has it? Which is effectively another home race, given the Bahraini sovereign wealth fund Mumtalakat has long been an investor in that team, a part owner. So should we expect it to bounce back and put that right? Could this be that home win that the Bahrainis so desire?
I think it's a really fascinating weekend, this one, because I think this will give us the true picture of where McLaren stacks up against the opposition, because this has been a weak track for them in the past. They have struggled with tyre temperatures in the past, but the impression we've got from the first races is that the car's quite difficult in single lap qualifying, which you were trackside a lot in Bahrain test, and it was obvious there, and we've seen it, and we saw the difficulties they had hooking the car up in Japan, which laid the foundations to open the door for Max Verstappen to grab pole and win that race. But the advantage we suspect McLaren's got, is that on rear limited tracks like this one, and we saw a bit in Australia, they're streets ahead and looking after their tyres. So the car may not be the ultimate fastest by much in qualifying, and it may not even be the fastest in qualifying. But on high deck races, on races especially that are rear limited with high deck, that McLaren should be streets ahead. So this is the weekend that McLaren should dominate based on what we saw from pre-season testing, based on what we know about the car. So if they come off that, then I think we can re-establish this kind of hierarchy that the McLaren do have the best race car for now. But if they don't come through this weekend, if there is more of a struggle, then I think it's a really interesting dynamic going forwards, especially with the Spanish Grand Prix coming up and the flexi wing clampdown, which is getting more and more kind of noise now and messages coming out of Red Bull that actually they think is going to be a bigger change than any of us have anticipated so far.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because there's kind of two versions of the Max Verstappen title push. There's the taking what was in Japan, the Red Bull was the second quickest car. The McLaren should have been on pole and should have won the race, but Verstappen nailed qualifying. The other two in the McLarens didn't. So you've got that version of the championship, but you've also got that version of the championship whereby he does that for 8 races, then it changes from Spain, as you say. So very interesting from that regard. And also, I think, if I had to put money on it, I'd say the McLaren would be the strongest car this weekend, but it's a good measure also of how close the Red Bull could be, how easy it is to consistently get it in a window. Lando Norris talked up the Red Bull's slow corner strengths after the race in Suzuka and saying, Bahrain could be tricky. And he's been saying Bahrain is going to be the tricky one for quite a while, actually. So interesting from that perspective, a bit of wind sensitivity, the rear instability, etc. So, yeah, I'm going to be really interested this weekend, just generally actually watching trackside, which I'll make sure I'll do on Friday, because it's a good chance to compare what I saw in the 3 days of testing compared to what we've got now. But you've then got the question of what Red Bull do, and of course the sub-question of how Yuki Tsunoda gets on. I think he could have a decent weekend, but it doesn't seem like Ferrari are going to be in the picture, does it? 2 or 3 tenths down in Suzuka, fairly clear. Still struggling in terms of not being able to run the car where they want to, ride height-wise. There's some talk of a new floor that may or may not run that has come out of Italy. I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but it seems difficult to imagine there's going to be a sudden turnaround for Ferrari.
Yeah, I think they were compromised in Japan by the ride height, which was a kind of consequence of what happened in China when they disqualified for the plank. So they had to lift it up in Japan. We didn't get an official figure for what difference it made, but Lewis, if you picked what Lewis Hamilton was talking about all weekend, because he just let little bits of information kind of get out there, but he talked about 1/10 a second. So if we kind of then cross-correlate where that car was versus the opposition, they look to be about 2 tenths off at the moment. But this is with a car that isn't sorted. And I think their problem isn't necessarily it's not the case of they want to run the ride height 1 millimetre lower for an ideal and tons of downforce and they can't do it because of the plank. I think it's more complicated. Involves the kind of the suspension, rear suspension, and the ride height transition between low speed corners when the car's higher than the high speed stuff when the car's lower, and then what it's doing on the kind of end of straight and even beginning of straight sometimes, as we saw in China, in wearing that plank down. So it's managing the transition between different types of corners, getting into the right window, and then finding a good balance with it, which they've not nailed so far. Charles Leclerc's talked about, he tried something, he said quite extreme on Friday in Suzuka. We've tried to get answers from him what it was, but we haven't got any firm information on what that is.
He did seem very happy, though.
He seemed happy, but I think if you also kind of read into what he was saying, I think he was happy with the car balance he had in Japan. He said there was nothing more to do. We were 2-3 tenths off the rest, and kind of the race played out. That was the limit. So I think they've got this problem of managing the ride height transitions and pitching the car and getting the balance sorted. But I think there is no doubt that car needs some improvements, needs more downforce, needs a bit of a lift if it's going to be challenging the McLarens and the Red Bull, which is making gains. But the Red Bull's not there yet either. Someone senior at the team told me that of all they've had a roadmap of the problems they had with last year's car and what they wanted to get sorted, and they still think they're only 25% of the way down that route to having a completely sorted car. So there's a lot more to come from the Red Bull. We see the Red Bull be in and out of this window. It's got this through corner balance problem of, sometimes oversteer on the entry to corners, which then quickly transitions into understeer. Max is better able to deal with that, but it left Liam Lawson a bit lost in terms of, how to cure this problem. Because you end up chasing one problem, you try and dial out the understeer on the entry, it just makes the oversteer worse, or you try and tame the oversteer and the understeer becomes much worse. So this is the battle Red Bull are facing. But also, half of me just thinks that maybe it's these cars. Maybe these cars, as they've hit this extreme levels of downforce and the peak, and the teams have kind of worked out where the limit is to avoid bouncing and hitting the ground. Actually, now they're just in a really uncomfortable place, and that no one is ever going to end up being happy with these cars, because I don't think they're very fun for the drivers or engineers to nail the perfect balance.
That's kind of what we hope for coming into the season as well, that you'll have, from track to track, the advantage will swing depending on what characteristics you've got, what balance you can achieve. And like you say, Ferrari's not that far off, Mercedes isn't that far off, seems to have a much less tricky car. But interesting to see how they do with the high temperatures we're expecting this weekend. They look really good in Bahrain in testing, and the cars generally look good on track, but this is going to be a temperature challenge. So yeah, there's quite a lot to learn this weekend, I think. And I always like having the kind of test venue the main test venue not being the first race, because then it all kind of merges into one. But they've been able to go away, do the first 3 weekends, go to Bahrain. Some have upgraded cars since then, so the difference will really interest me, and we'll certainly be writing about that and talking about that during the weekend.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Wow, this house is cute. But can I really get in the game in this economy? I do have savings, and I am responsible-ish. Ugh, I should bury it. I'm being wild. But what if I'm not being wild, though? Could I actually score a...
Kick off your home buying journey with Zillow's new BuyAbility tool. It makes it easy to find out what you can afford, so you can get off the bench and onto the playing field with confidence. Check your BuyAbility only on Zillow.
At the Hyundai Getaway Sales Event, get deals so right, it almost feels wrong. Now's the best time to get that Hyundai you've always wanted. Plus, every new Hyundai comes with America's Best Warranty and 3 years or 36,000 miles of limited complimentary maintenance. Don't think you can get away with all that? Think again. The Hyundai Getaway Sales Event. Visit your local Hyundai dealer today. It's a great day for a new Hyundai.
Right, we're going to tackle a few more questions from the Race Members Club now that came in after the race in Japan. So thanks very much to everybody who sent in questions. Sorry we can't get to all of them. If you're interested in the Race Members Club, you can click the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the race. Loads of offers there in terms of what you can get, in terms of exactly which tier, in terms of whether you just want F1 content or MotoGP content as well. And there's ad-free listening for podcasts. There's advanced viewing of articles and videos. Very, very, very plentiful exclusive bonus content. We've been really enjoying doing that. We'll be doing more of that this weekend. But anyway, let's pile in. John, a question from Harry. Regarding the discussion about V10s in Bahrain, why is Cadillac not invited, as they will be one of the engine manufacturers for the next engine regs and also the potential V10s? So what's Cadillac's status in this?
Well, I think there's two separate kind of situations here. I think, and I've still not, this was a question that I've had myself, and I've had conflicting answers on this. So I can't pretend that I know 100% of what's going on, partly because the power unit governance agreement isn't a published document, it's top secret. So I think there's two elements. There's the meeting and the dialogue for Friday's meeting, which I understand Cadillac, will have a representative there because it is entering Formula One and is planning to become a manufacturer. And this meeting isn't about taking a vote and deciding the path. It's merely just to get everyone's opinions around a table and get a consensus of where everyone's sat on it. There's that element. But then there's also the power unit governance agreement that decides regulations and rules, which I'm told Cadillac aren't yet a part of because they haven't yet committed formally to a definitive entry. So at the moment, the votes is just the 5 manufacturers. And if you're going to change the rules in such a way that we go to V8, V10 in 29, or 30, 29, or 28, which is probably the earliest it could possibly be, then it needs what's effectively a supermajority, which is the FIA to vote in favour, FOM to vote in favour, and then 4 of the 5 current manufacturers to go that way as well. So I don't know at what point Cadillac get a vote on this, but I'd be surprised if they can have a formal vote on something before they've actually entered the championship. So, but I will do some more digging just to try to get some clarity on this. But it's one of those things in Formula 1, sometimes you get completely contrasting information from different people, and you're trying to dig a bit more to find out. So if I do find out some more, I shall let you know.
Well, it makes sense for Cadillac to not be fully actively involved because their timeline might be a 2031 engine, which is the new engine anyway. So, yeah, it would make sense for them not to have that active vote. But, yeah, they'll certainly be a player in it, let's put it that way. Right, next question comes from Jeff O'Boyle. Does the dullest dishwater race in Suzuka prove that F1 cannot solve the problem with dirty air? V10s might sound great, but unless the cars shrink and the air gets simplified, the racing isn't going to improve. Stick a halo on the 2005 cars and make F1 great again. Well, the problem with dirty air isn't ever going to be solved. It can only ever be mitigated because of the laws of physics, unless you do it in a vacuum, as I like to say, unless there's some way to achieve that, which creates...
Why aren't they doing that, Ed?
Creates all sorts of problems. There's probably somebody suggesting that as a solution, because sometimes, there's easy answers. That's the only way to stop dirty air.
How much downforce would there be in a vacuum?
Well, none. That's the problem. Well, as well as the practical problem of creating this mysterious vacuum and then making sure the drivers can breathe and everyone can operate. So, the problem will never be solved. It can only ever be mitigated. I don't think they've done too badly with these rules mitigating it, because it's always going to be an object moving through the air at high speed that's always going to disrupt the airflow, and these are heavily aero cars. So the only way to change that really is to reduce the dependence on aero, and if you do that, you make the cars a lot slower, because aerodynamic grip multi-fold outstrips any mechanical grip you'll ever achieve, massively so. And I don't actually agree that stick it on the 2005 cars will make the racing good. The 2005 cars struggled massively. It was a problem there, the turbulence and the dirty air. So I don't think that would work in terms of having that sort of car. I mean, certainly a lighter car, certainly a smaller car helps, but you're still going to have dirty air. And with how well refined the aero is going to be, the dirty air is always going to be a solution. There's no answer to this, is there? That you can chip away at it. You can certainly do better, but every time they've done sort of something to try and tackle it, it then gets worse again as teams push the envelope in terms of what can be done.
Yeah, I think Suzuka was an interesting event, because it wasn't just dirty air that made the race not exciting. There are a bunch of other factors. Track layout there isn't actually ideal for racing.
Great track layouts for driving often don't lead to great racing.
Exactly. So there's one DRS zone, which isn't very long for a start. And it goes into the very high speed turn 1, so it doesn't actually lead into a braking zone. So you can't make any lunge into turn 1 there. So DRS isn't very effective. You could have DRS coming out of spoon if you wanted, but at the moment, and ironically on a weekend where there's lots of talk about automatic DRS being shut off, for example, it goes into 130R. So you can't have, under the current regulations, the way things are, you can't have DRS coming out of spoon. So you had poor DRS zone. Then the resurfacing had made the first sector grippier and less punishing on the tyres, which dropped the degradation. So we had a race where there was almost zero degradation on the tyres. So you didn't have that tyre offset that we get in the past. We get sometimes, we didn't get 2 stops. So that was probably a bigger factor than the dirty air, actually, the fact that it wasn't about time management, wasn't any offsets, wasn't really a chance to do much on the strategy. And the other factor we have to take into consideration, which I think kind of goes under the radar, is one of the consequences of having a grid that's really, really close, where there's less than a tenth of a second covering 3-4 cars, is you don't get an offset of performance between those cars if there isn't an offset on the tyres. So this is why you get trains of cars and potentially DRS trains where people can't overtake. It's because all the cars are so similar in performance, actually it doesn't produce great racing. And I go back to, I just remember when I covered BTCC in the mid-90s, we had a super close grid of, I think a lot of it was less than a second from the start to the front, cars that had some aero but not great aero, and spectacular qualifying sessions, mixed up grids a lot of the time, but the racing often wasn't fantastic because people can't overtake. So there are lots of factors that influence what makes a good race for overtaking. And unfortunately, Suzuka had all the kind of X marks for this hasn't worked, and this hasn't worked, and this hasn't worked, and this hasn't worked. And that's why it didn't prove to be one of the greatest races. And also, it's also interesting that drivers like being able to push tyres and not worry about degradation, but actually that doesn't produce great racing either. So lots of topics to kind of contemplate when we come to decide what F1 should be in the future based on what we saw at Suzuka, I think.
Yeah, the bottom line is, as you've laid out there, the short version is variables create racing, don't they? And if you have, a series of cars that are a similar pace, the external variables on tyres, etc. aren't there, then why do you expect to have the dramatic racing going on? So that's always the battle, creating those variables, which is why you then get the criticism of, this is a bit artificial. But often you have to inject in those variables to mean that cars aren't just all running around at a relatively similar percentage of their pace, because they're outright 100% paces, so similar as well. So they all kind of move around in lockstep if they do. Right, a question now from Stuart Coulter for you, John. We heard last year Zak Brown repeatedly voiced concerns about the Red Bull RB alliance. This season, Racing Bulls would appear to be more competitive than they were in 2024. Yet I haven't heard any similar complaints or allegations made by Zak, or indeed any of the other upper midfield runners who are battling Racing Bulls for the minor points position. So what gives? I would say, if you followed the recent F1 sim racing event, there was some tremendous annoyance about a Racing Bulls driver driving seconds off the pace to hold up rivals. I think a Ferrari driver, and I think Mercedes were annoyed as well. So there was a bit of a controversy there, but that was in the F1 sim racing world. We're talking about the real world here, but I just thought that was an amusing little vignette of the kind of thing that's sort of been feared in the real world, but has never fully happened.
Yeah, I think because this came up at the start of last year, and it was something Zak was definitely pushing himself, because it wasn't the media pushing him to get answers from it. There were times where he would throw this out there in press conferences or media events. But I think things have changed on two fronts. I mean, first of all, McLaren's in a different game now and different focus and targets to where it was even 12 months ago. That its constructors champion is targeting both championships. It's focused on winning races. It's fights with the Red Bull main team. So I think what goes on in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th place or further back doesn't really can't take up any of their time, because there's so much to think about and get sorted. Does that change that perspective? And the second thing, I think a lot of the pushing last year was to get some clarification on what was allowed and wasn't allowed for sharing information and movements of staff, and what is in the cost cap and what's not in the cost cap. And I think in the end, McLaren probably got a lot of those answers all sorted in terms of there being a distinction between what Racing Bulls were doing and what Red Bull were doing. And we see it also with Haas and with Ferrari. So I think they're quite comfortable now with these teams that have alliances but aren't necessarily kind of the complete, I don't know how you describe it really, partner teams, or
they're partnerships, aren't they? They're not common ownership. Yeah, but it's not to say. I think they just didn't want a scenario where Racing Bulls and Red Bull had identical cars and were locking out all the positions at the front, and it didn't happen. I think maybe that was a scenario that Zak feared last year, that there'd be big progress, that Racing Bulls could take all the Red Bull bits and be fighting at the front, but it's not happened. But I think invariably, if there comes a time where that Racing Bulls is super quick and it's battling the McLarens, or there's a moment where those Racing Bulls influence something and help Red Bull win, then it will come back onto the table, just as it did last year in Singapore when Ricciardo got that fastest lap at the end and took the point away from Lando Norris. So I think it's just down the list of priorities, but it can flare up, but I don't think it's a big issue for them at the moment. Yeah, I do think as a general rule, as I've said before, for sporting integrity purposes, it's better to avoid having multiple teams owned by the same entity. There's a lot of sports that prevent that. In fact, there's a recent news story about the Club World Cup in football, where the Mexican Club Leon have been removed from it because there's another club owned by the same entity. So I do think it's worth doing that. Although Racing Bulls and Red Bull, obviously that's a long-standing thing, so you couldn't just suddenly force them to do it. I think there's ways you can kind of incentivise and persuade somebody to sell a team. I think Bernie Ecclestone would make sure that would happen, but hopefully in future there won't be repeats of this. I don't think there have been any problems fundamentally, though. Racing Bulls, whatever that team's been called, have always, to an extent, gone their own way. And look at it now. If you want confirmation of how different the teams are, you've got the Red Bull that's probably got the narrowest windows, the trickiest to get a time out of. And then you've got the Racing Bulls, which has probably got the widest window and is one of the more benign ones that you can get the pace out of, even though they've got the same, broadly the same mechanical platform. So that's just an interesting little example. Right, another question that I'll take from Scuderia Irish. Many of us in the comments highlighted the wins from pole, dirty air being a killer and lack of great racing. Would a mandatory 2-stop with all 3 tyre compounds help? A little bit, but it would create the opportunity for something else to happen, but I don't think it would fundamentally change anything because you just get another pit stop phase. And yeah, you can change what tyre compound you've got, but as we saw, tyre compound offsets weren't having a huge value anyway. The soft runners weren't making up loads of places generally. Sainz, I think, gained a place, but it wasn't making a huge difference. So I don't think it would have made much difference. And I see that mandatory 2-stop and use all 3 compounds suggested quite a lot. But again, while it would just create one more variable, you wouldn't get 1 stop, as everyone would ultimately do similar things and cover each other. So again, for me, it's a little bit of a band-aid solution. I quite like the idea of them doing it for Monaco to just create a little bit more jeopardy, I guess. But it's a band-aid, really. It's a very minor sort of thing. Right, John, the final question from Smudge789. Is it utterly ridiculous to think Red Bull's current lineup is a preview of Aston Martin for 2027? Noting the Honda link for both drivers, the rumours about Aston Martin being willing to pay big bucks for Verstappen, and most importantly, the no driver that's won a world championship with Newey has won one afterwards without him.
I don't think it's ridiculous. It could be one of the options on the table for 27. I think next year will be fascinating from the driver market perspective. From what I understand and kind of the messaging we're getting out of the Verstappen camp is that he's committed there for next season, irrespective of performance clauses and if there was a way out. But
it's a logical move because he'd be moving based on limited information, wouldn't he, if he did decide to make the move for 26?
Exactly. You can, no matter what you're being promised on in terms of performance and what Mercedes may be saying or Red Bull are saying on their engine or an Audi or anyone, it's complete guesswork. No one knows who's nailed the power unit next year. No one knows who's nailed the car. No one knows who's nailed the fuel, because the fuel spread could be quite immense next year as well. So this is why by the time into 2026, see where everything shakes up, because if the homologation rules don't change, if everyone is locked in for a while, then it will become fairly obvious which is the team to be at. If Red Bull, do nail it and they're winning again, then Max stays. There's not a problem. If Mercedes have nailed it, that becomes obviously an interesting prospect. If Honda have nailed it, then suddenly Aston Martin are there with seats available, pending what Fernando Alonso wants to do for 27. But he's approaching the end of his career, and I think Aston would jump at getting Max Verstappen on if they could. So I think everything's up in the air, and I wouldn't rule anything out for 2027. My best guess is that Verstappen keeps a close eye on what happens at the start of next year, and then whichever team is at the top of the rankings will become the target, pending where Red Bull is. Because I think if the next year's Red Bull's like this year's, where even just slightly behind, he's thriving in this being the underdog. He's absolutely loving races like Japan. I think give him much more satisfaction than disappearing off into the distance and winning by 30 seconds. If he can do that and they keep winning and they can go to the championship, it won't be a problem. If Red Bull engine doesn't work, if they're at the back, if it's Mercedes at the top or it's Ferrari at the top or it's Audi at the top, then I think things could get very, very interesting. But I wouldn't rule. I think there could be a lot of movement next year, pending how things shake up. And it's impossible to anyone who's got any inkling of how things shake up next year. I'd like to get the lottery numbers as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to foresee. There's a lot of stuff that will change. And anyone who listened to our Predicting the Driver Market podcast at the start of last year will know how one factor changing just has a knock-on effect on everything. I would say with Tsunoda, from what I understand of that deal, Honda don't have the influence to sort of say, yeah, pick our driver, put him in. there's always the possibility some commercial agreement they could come up with, but it'll come down to Aston Martin's choice. So I think Tsunoda's chance of being there depends primarily on his own performance and whether he can make himself a contender, plus if they've got a seat, because obviously Lance Stroll has got that seat sort of in perpetuity until he doesn't, I guess, and that could still be the case in 27. But I think Tsunoda, I mean, Honda could put him in there as a third driver maybe if he doesn't have a race drive. That could happen, but I think as a race driver it'll depend on Tsunoda's own form. And what a great opportunity he's got now, because he's in that Red Bull. It's a tricky car. If he does a handy job in that car, which isn't winning races, then his reputation will be bolstered and he could be a very legitimate contender for that seat. So yeah, going to be really interesting to see how the driver market evolves, but I think there's a lot of people who are going to be just keeping a watching brief, and yeah, that's certainly logical for Verstappen to take a cautious approach. Well, thanks very much to everyone who sent in questions. Thanks, John, for hot-footing it from the airport to have this chat. We're going to be with you throughout the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend. As I say, there'll be loads of content on the website. We'll have the podcast at the end of the weekend. Loads of extra stuff for members on Patreon as well, and obviously there'll be plenty of videos with us chatting in the paddock as well. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the Bahrain Grand Prix.
The Athletic.